No, I am actually here with David Rubenstein, who is the co-founder and co-executive chairman of Carlyle, our special guest this morning. And speaking of politics, one of the biggest political pieces of news that has moved the markets in, the last year and a half or so is that of the trade war. And this morning there was news out that said that the U.S. and China are considering rolling back some of the tariffs that were put in place in September. You were actually on Squawk Box over the summer where you said that you think there would be a resolution to the trade war by the end of the year. It is November. Is this it?
I do think that they're close to an agreement. I believe had they had the APEC summit in Chile, they probably would have signed something. That might be postponed a little bit now, but I do think they've reached conceptual agreement on the key things on phase one. Phase one is not everything, but it's enough to get people feeling that this is not a big issue for the economy for the next year or so.
And in terms of concessions for the U.S., there's been talks of China buying more agricultural products, for example, but what about some of the hard stuff? That's another thing that you've been focused on, IP, market access to China. Does that get accomplished?
Phase one will have some market access and we'll have some protection for copyrights and patents and so forth. But I don't think all the issues are resolved. The key thing not resolved is China 2025. Those are the issues related to China trying to develop its technology in, let's say, artificial intelligence or semiconductor design, things that we are really competitive with them on, and they are trying to do much more than we would like them to do using government resources to make themselves a bigger player in that area. And that's what they have not resolved yet. They're not going to resolve that before the end of the year.
But you think the market, all they really need to see, in essence, is just a phase one deal. They don't need to see the nitty-gritty deals.
The market would love a comprehensive deal, but you don't get everything you want in life, right? So a phase one deal, I think expectations have been lowered. I think will be enough to make the markets think that we don't have to worry about a China trade war over the next year or so.
So it'll calm the markets maybe up until the 2020 election then?
It should do enough for about a year or so, I think.
Okay. Well, speaking of the stock markets, again, hit a record high yesterday. Looks like it's appearing to open in the green again today. When you see this tape, does it make you nervous that the markets are overbought relative to fundamentals, or do you think that it is potentially gearing up for some sort of a breakout even higher from here, especially given what you're looking at with
Well, I don't get nervous when my own stock is going up. I think that's a good thing. But generally, I always think my own stock, Carlyle, is undervalued. But generally, I would say we've been at a peak for a while, and I just don't know how much longer this can continue. But we've been saying it's at a peak for a couple of years now, and we've been wrong because it keeps going higher. So right now, the economy is in reasonable shape. It's not going to be heroic growth of 3 or 4%, but 2% is really likely next year.
Do you still think that we're due for a recession?
There will be a recession at some point, but I don't know when. We always have them. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't think today there looks like there's going to be a recession in 2020. I think there's enough strength in the economy to go past 2020. I can't predict further than that. But right now, I don't think there's a recession likely in 2020 unless some exogenous event we can't predict all of a sudden happens in a geopolitical world.
Now, Joe mentioned politics 2020, obviously 1 year out from now. One of the big topics on the campaign trail has been this idea of wealth redistribution. And yesterday on CNBC, Leon Cooperman told Scott Wapner he called you a philanthropist with a capital P as an example of a billionaire, a wealthy individual who should not have to pay more in taxes because of all the money that you give back to society. Do you agree with his dog in the fight?
Well, he's a very smart man, but I would say generally I am giving away all of my money. I signed the giving pledge. I was one of the first 40 to do so, and I'm going to give away more than half, basically all my money. And I think that taxes are a different issue than philanthropy. I think the taxes now in the United States are not completely fair for everybody. I think there could be improvements. I'm not sure everything done in the last tax act was perfect, but no tax act is ever perfect. And I think tax inequality is a big issue, but I don't know that there's going to be one solution that's going to solve everything. I don't think all of a sudden a wealth tax, for example, would solve all our society's problems if one could ever actually be implemented.
Do you think there are improvements that need to be made in terms of how the taxation of the super wealthy in our country are?
You can always make improvements in taxes, but I'm not sure that there's any one thing that's going to solve our problems. If you tax the upper income people, there aren't enough of those people to really make a wealth distribution effect that's going to be significant. There just aren't enough highly wealthy people. So you have to do something at the middle class. The problem is that the middle class is roughly $65,000 per family of four, and people don't like to get taxed at that level. So there just aren't enough people at $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 and above to really make a gigantic wealth redistribution. I think taxes will be a big issue in the general election campaign, but I don't expect to see any major tax bill anytime soon because we haven't had one for many years. We had one in 2017. It takes about 4, 5, 6 years before you get another tax bill because there has to be a lot of political support for it. There's not one right now for a major overhaul of the tax code again, I think.
Even if there's a change in party
Well, you'd have to change both houses as well because taxes presidents talk about taxes, but when they get in office, they realize that the House Ways and Means Committee really writes the tax laws, and then the Senate Finance Committee adjusts it a bit, and there's a conference committee. Presidents have some impact on taxes, but not as much as they might think when they're campaigning.
Well, speaking of, changes under a potential new leadership, Senator Elizabeth Warren has proposed a set of sweeping changes for your industry, the private equity industry, looking at, among other things, making GPs responsible for the debt and pension obligations. People I've spoken with in the industry have said this would be, a nail in the coffin for private equity. Is that something that you think is realistic?
I don't think it won't likely happen. I don't think there's any political support for her proposal in Congress that I've seen from members on either side. I think when you run for president, you say many things you think are going to get you votes, and you realize when you become president, some of those things aren't going to happen. So I think it would be a disaster for the industry, but I think it would be a disaster for the economy. Private equity creates a lot of jobs and preserves a lot of jobs and pays a lot of taxes. And we are the center of the world in private equity in the United States. And if we're going to hurt this industry, I think it's going to hurt the U.S. economy.
And unfortunately, I have to wrap here, but I do want to note you had a new book that came out just last week.
Well, thank you for this.
Interviewing historians.
It's about my effort to educate members of Congress a little bit about American history. I interview great historians in front of members of Congress once a month, and this is a summary of it.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how, the next chapter of this book, the next edition of this book, looks upon this time in history.